For 15 years, my husband told me we were barely making ends meet. I saved on everything. But I accidentally found a card in his jacket with a $3 million balance. I waited until he fell asleep. What I did next, he never saw coming. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I was lucky. That sounds almost embarrassing to admit now, but it's true. Every morning, I'd wake up in our colonial-style house on Birchwood Lane, make a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint, and stand at the kitchen window watching the oak tree we planted the year we moved in. Daniel would come downstairs in his pressed shirt, kiss me on the cheek. Always the cheek, never the lips. But I told myself that was just 15 years of marriage, that passion naturally settles into something quieter, something comfortable. I believed that. I needed to believe that. We had a life that looked perfect from the outside. A 4-bedroom house in Claremont Hills, Ohio, a golden retriever named Biscuit who destroyed every throw pillow we owned. 2 cars in the driveway. His, a leased Audi. Mine, a 7-year-old Honda I'd driven until the check engine light became a permanent fixture of the dashboard. Our daughter, Lily, was in her 2nd year at Ohio State, which we were paying for through a combination of her partial scholarship, student loans, and my careful monthly transfers from our joint account. Every dollar counted. Daniel had made sure I knew that. "We're barely keeping our heads above water, Claire," he'd say, and I would nod and cut the grocery list in half. That was the phrase he used. Barely keeping our heads above water. He said it the first time about 3 years into our marriage, when I suggested we take a vacation to the coast. He said it when Lily needed braces at 13. He said it when my mother had a fall, and I asked if we could help with her medical bills. The phrase became the architecture of our financial life. 4 walls I was not allowed to question. So I didn't question. I couponed. I bought store-brand everything. I took on freelance bookkeeping work from home, small business clients, nothing glamorous, but it helped. I told myself we were a team. I told myself sacrifice was love. The first sign that something was wrong, the real first sign, before everything else, was small enough that I almost didn't catch it. About 8 months before the card, I noticed Daniel had started taking his phone into the bathroom. Not unusual by itself. But then he started leaving the room to take calls. Then he began coming home later on Thursdays, always with a different explanation. A client dinner, a delayed flight, traffic on the 71. Each reason was perfectly reasonable. Each reason was a different shape. I remember standing in our bedroom one evening, folding laundry while he was in the shower, and thinking, something is different. I couldn't name it then. The feeling was like a splinter under the skin. No visible wound, just a low, persistent ache. I ignored it. I was good at ignoring things. Then came the Thursday in October. It was raining. A flat, Midwestern rain that turns everything the same gray. Daniel had worn his charcoal blazer to work, the nice one, the Italian wool he saved for important meetings. He'd left it on the armchair by the bedroom door. I was bringing it to the closet when something shifted inside the breast pocket, a small, hard rectangle. I told myself it was a business card, a receipt, a hotel key card from some conference. I pulled it out. It was a credit card, black, sleek, the kind of card that doesn't advertise its limits because it doesn't need to. Issued in Daniel's name, a bank I didn't recognize. Not our bank, not any account I'd ever seen on our tax returns or our joint statements. I turned it over in my hands. The card was worn at the corners, which meant it wasn't new, it had been used. Regularly. I sat down on the edge of the bed. My hands, I noticed, were completely steady. That surprised me. I'd always imagined that a moment like this, if a moment like this ever came, would feel like falling. Instead, it felt like the opposite. Like something inside me had gone very, very still. I put the card back in the pocket. I hung the blazer in the closet. I went back to folding laundry. And I waited for Daniel to come out of the shower, watched him towel off and get dressed and make a joke about the weather, and I smiled at the right moments. And I said nothing. But that night, after he fell asleep, his breathing slow and even, completely unbothered, I lay in the dark beside him and I thought about 15 years. I thought about every vacation I hadn't taken, every winter coat I'd worn 2 seasons past its usefulness, every time I'd transferred my own earnings into the joint account like a good partner, like a team player, while somewhere out there a black credit card accumulated a balance I had never been allowed to see. I didn't cry. I started to think. I didn't sleep that night. Not a minute. I lay there listening to Daniel breathe, that infuriating, peaceful rhythm. And I did arithmetic in my head. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of, we can't afford it. 15 years of me believing we were partners in scarcity, when apparently we were partners in something else entirely. I thought about the Honda with its permanent check engine light. I thought about Lily's student loans. I thought about my mother's medical bills, which we had not helped with, because Daniel said we couldn't. And I had accepted that because I trusted him. By the time the bedroom began to gray with morning light, I had arrived at a single, clarifying conclusion. I did not yet know the full shape of what he had done to me, and I could not afford to act until I did. That thought, I cannot afford to act, almost made me laugh. After 15 years of being told what we couldn't afford, here I was, rationing my own outrage. I got up before he did, made the coffee, let Biscuit out into the backyard, stood at the kitchen window like any other morning. When Daniel came downstairs, I handed him his mug, asked about his schedule, listened to him describe a Thursday meeting that meant nothing to me, and gave him nothing. No crack in the surface, no tremor in the voice. I had spent 15 years performing contentment. I knew how to perform it one more morning. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, and I did what any self-employed bookkeeper with 15 years of financial training does when she discovers an anomaly. I started pulling records. I had access to our joint checking, our joint savings, and the mortgage account. I went back 3 years, as far as our online statements went without requesting paper records. And I looked at everything with fresh eyes. Not the eyes of a trusting wife, the eyes of a professional looking for discrepancies. They were everywhere, once I knew to look for them. Every month, between the 15th and the 20th, there was a transfer out of our joint account, amounts ranging from $800 to $2,200, to something labeled simply Household Operations LLC. I had seen those transfers before and assumed, without ever checking, that they were connected to the house, the security system contract maybe, or a maintenance service. I had never verified. I had trusted. I Googled Household Operations LLC Ohio. Nothing credible came up. A ghost entity registered somewhere to someone. I wrote it down. Then I looked at Daniel's business. He ran a mid-sized commercial real estate consulting firm, Mercer Advisory Group, which he'd built over the last decade. I was not involved in the business. I handled our personal finances. He handled everything commercial. That division had always seemed logical, professional, even respectful of separate expertise. Now it looked like a wall he'd built to keep me out. I couldn't access Mercer Advisory's accounts, but I could access our tax returns, which I kept organized in a fireproof box in the home office closet. I pulled the last 5 years. What I found made my stomach drop. Daniel's declared income had been consistent, between $180,000 and $210,000 annually. That was real money, comfortable money, not barely keeping our heads above water money, not your mother's medical bills aren't our problem money. not Lily needs to take out loans money. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I thought about the black card and the bank name on it, Crestline Private Banking. And I opened a new browser tab and searched for them. They were real, a private banking subsidiary serving high net worth individuals. Minimum account threshold to qualify for their signature black card. $500,000 in deposits. My hands finally started to shake. I made myself stop. I closed the laptop. I walked to the window and looked at the oak tree and breathed. Shaking wouldn't help. Crying wouldn't help. What I needed, what I absolutely required before I could do anything, was documentation, a clear picture of exactly what existed, and someone in my corner who understood the law. I thought about calling a friend. My closest friend, Renata, had been through a divorce 6 years ago. Messy, financial, ugly. She'd come out the other side, but I couldn't risk Daniel finding out I was asking questions. And Renata, God love her, had never successfully kept a secret in her life. No. What I needed first was a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. A family law attorney with specific experience in financial concealment cases. Someone who had seen this before, who wouldn't be surprised, who could tell me exactly what I was looking at, and exactly what my options were. I knew how to research. I was a bookkeeper. I understood paper trails. I spent the rest of the morning building a list. 4 attorneys in the greater Columbus area, all women, not out of principle, but because my instincts said I needed someone who would not subconsciously minimize what I was describing. I read reviews, checked bar association records, looked at published cases. By noon, I had one name circled. Margaret Holloway, Holloway Family Law, 15 years specializing in high-asset divorces and financial fraud within marriage. I called from my cell phone, standing in the backyard so the walls of our house couldn't hear me. The consultation was scheduled for Monday, 3 days away. 3 days of making Daniel his coffee and asking about his schedule and giving him absolutely nothing. I could do that. I had, it turned out, been doing it for 15 years. That afternoon, I drove to an office supply store and bought a small, fireproof lockbox, the kind with a combination I set myself. I transferred every relevant document into it. 5 years of tax returns, printed bank statements, the notes I'd taken that morning. I stored it in my car, in the locked compartment under the trunk liner, where Daniel never went. Then I drove home, made dinner, and set the table for 2. Monday morning, I told Daniel I had a client meeting downtown. That was easy. I had clients. I had downtown meetings. The lie fit perfectly into the shape of my normal life. I wore a plain gray blazer and drove the Honda to a glass and brick building on High Street, where Margaret Holloway's office occupied the entire 4th floor. Her assistant offered me water. I asked for coffee. Margaret herself came out to the waiting room to greet me rather than making me wait to be called, which I registered as a small but deliberate act of respect. She was in her early 50s, with the kind of calm that isn't coldness, but is clearly earned. She closed the conference room door, sat across from me, and said, "Tell me what's happening." So I told her, all of it. The 15 years of financial frugality, the phrase barely keeping our heads above water and how many times it had been used as a lever, the transfers to Household Operations LLC, the tax returns showing real income that had never translated into real quality of life, the black Crestline card, the balance I'd glimpsed, $3 million. I laid it out the way I would present a client's irregular ledger, without drama, with sequence. Margaret listened without interrupting. She took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she set her pen down and said, "Claire, what you're describing has a name. It's called financial abuse within marriage, and in Ohio, it has specific legal implications when it comes to property division." She explained what the next steps looked like. A forensic accountant, someone who could trace hidden assets, follow the LLC registrations, map the money. A formal discovery process once divorce proceedings began. The importance of not alerting Daniel prematurely, of not moving money or making large purchases that could be characterized later as dissipation of assets. "He'll have attorneys," she said. "Good ones, probably, but money hidden during a marriage in Ohio is marital property. All of it. The question is finding it." I signed her retainer agreement before I left. I felt, walking back to my car on High Street, something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, more like alignment. The sensation of my circumstances finally matching what I actually knew to be true. That same week, something shifted with Daniel. I didn't do anything differently. I was careful. But Daniel had spent 15 years studying me the way all controlling people study the people they control, watching for deviations, irregularities, anything that disrupted his model of who I was. On Wednesday evening, at dinner, he looked at me for slightly too long when I answered a question about my day. Just a second's worth of extra attention. Then he looked away. On Thursday, he came home early, something he almost never did on Thursdays. I was in the home office when I heard his key in the door. I closed the tab I had open, a page on Ohio marital property law, and switched to a client spreadsheet before he reached the room. He stood in the doorway. "You're home early," I said, without turning from the screen. "Meetings wrapped up." A pause. "What are you working on?" "Quarterly reconciliation for the Bellworth account." I clicked through 2 columns. "Tedious." He stood there for another moment. Then, "I'll start dinner." He never started dinner. I kept my eyes on the screen and breathed. It was around this time, I learned later, that he mentioned to her that something felt off. Her name was Sasha Brennan. She was 34, worked as an account manager at Mercer Advisory, had been sleeping with my husband for at least 3 years. I didn't know her name yet. I knew there was likely someone. The pattern of Thursday evenings had always suggested as much. But I didn't have a name until the forensic accountant Margaret hired gave me one. His name was David Park, CPA, forensic specialization. He billed at $350 an hour and was worth every cent. Within 12 days, he had traced Household Operations LLC to a shell registered in Nevada, controlled by a separate holding entity, co-registered with a second individual, Sasha Brennan. The transfers from our joint account, $800 to $2,200 per month, every month for 4 years, had been going directly into an account she and Daniel held jointly. Not a business account, a personal one. David presented me with a 30-page preliminary report on a Thursday morning in Margaret's conference room. I read it at the table while Margaret sat across from me. Page 7 was the one that made everything real. There was a property I didn't know about, a 2-bedroom condo in the short North District of Columbus, purchased 3 years ago for $410,000 in cash, titled Under Household Operations LLC. Daniel had paid for it with money funneled through the LLC. Money that had originated partially from our joint accounts. He had bought her an apartment with our money, while telling me we were barely surviving. I set the report down on the table. I looked at Margaret. "Is this enough?" I asked. "It's enough to begin," she said. "And we're not done finding it." I thought about the card again, the black card, the $3 million balance. I thought about my Honda and my mother's medical bills and Lily's student loans. "Good," I said. "Then let's not stop." I drove home, made dinner, set the table for 2. And I did not look at Daniel any differently than I had the night before, or the night before that. But something had changed irrevocably, and it could not be put back. Margaret filed on a Tuesday. The divorce petition, combined with an emergency motion for asset preservation, landed in Daniel's hands via process server on a Wednesday morning at his office. I know this because his assistant, a woman named Patrice, who had always been inexplicably kind to me at the Mercer Christmas parties, texted me that afternoon. Just 4 words. It happened. Stay strong. I hadn't asked her to tell me. She did it anyway. People, I was learning, could surprise you. I was at the kitchen table when the text came in. I read it, put the phone face down, and finished my coffee. He called 40 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. Then a text. Call me. Now. Then, 3 minutes after that. Claire? What the hell is this? I turned my phone over and called Margaret. He's been served, I said. I know, she said. His attorney called us 20 minutes ago. Daniel retained Mitchell and Greer this morning. Mitchell and Greer. I knew the name. One of the most aggressive family law firms in Columbus, known for high asset divorces and tactics that leaned hard on the word aggressive. It cost money to retain them. Significant money. The fact that Daniel had managed to call and retain them within 2 hours of being served told me something important. He had been anticipating this. Maybe not this specifically, maybe not this week. But he'd been ready. The next 48 hours were loud. Daniel came home that evening. He walked in the front door and stood in the hallway and looked at me like I was someone he'd never seen before. Biscuit padded over to greet him. He ignored the dog. 15 years, he said. His voice was controlled, too controlled, the kind of controlled that takes real effort. 15 years, and you do this without one conversation. I had a lot of conversations, I said, by myself, in my own head, for 15 years. Claire. I know about Sasha Brennan, I said. I know about the LLC. I know about the condo in Short North. I kept my voice level. I know about the Crestline account. I know the balance. Something moved across his face. Not guilt. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't guilt. It was calculation. He was recalibrating, figuring out the shape of what I knew, measuring how far the ground had shifted under him. That's business, he said. The LLC is a legitimate business structure. David Park is a forensic accountant, I said. He has 30 pages that disagree with you. He left the house that night. But the silence that followed his leaving was not peaceful. The next morning, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said, "Claire, we should talk." It was Sasha. I had never heard her voice before. It was younger than I expected, and tighter. The kind of tight that comes from adrenaline. "I don't think we should," I said, and ended the call. 2 days later, she showed up. I came out to my car in the driveway, the Honda still with its check engine light, and found Sasha Brennan leaning against the hood. She was attractive, which I noted the way you note weather, as a fact with no emotional content attached to it. Dark hair, expensive coat, a certain practiced composure that cracked just slightly when she saw the expression on my face. "I just want you to understand," she began, "that Daniel and I'm going to stop you there," I said. "Anything you say to me directly can be used in our legal proceedings, and I have to tell you that my attorney has specifically advised me not to engage with you informally. You're welcome to have your attorney contact Margaret Holloway." She stared at me. Then she said, very quietly, "You're going to regret this." I got in my car and drove to a client meeting. That evening, Mitchell and Greer filed a motion arguing that the asset preservation order was overreaching and punitive, and that Daniel's business accounts, including, strategically, the Crestline account, were entirely separate from marital assets. They were aggressive as advertised. They cited 3 Ohio precedents and peppered the filing with language designed to make my forensic evidence sound like speculation. Margaret called me that night after I'd read the filing. "They're good," she said. "I know," I said. "But David Park is better." She laughed, which was the right response. The following week was the hardest. Daniel's attorneys sent a letter to my bookkeeping clients, 3 of them, suggesting, without quite saying directly, that my professional conduct was under review as part of ongoing litigation. 2 clients called me, nervous. I had to spend 2 days reassuring them, transparently and calmly explaining that this was a litigation tactic with no factual basis, providing them with my professional certifications and a brief summary from Margaret confirming no professional allegations had been made. It was designed to destabilize me. It almost worked. After the second client call, I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger for about 20 minutes. Not crying, just sitting. Feeling the weight of it, the money, the years, the deliberate cruelty of using my livelihood as a pressure point. Then I drove home. I gave myself the rest of that week. I didn't look at documents. I didn't read legal filings. I watched bad television and let Biscuit sleep on the foot of my bed and ordered Thai food twice. Lily called from Columbus, and I told her, gently, that her father and I were separating, that she didn't need to choose sides, that I was okay. She cried a little. I held the phone and let her. "Mom," she said, "are you actually okay?" "Not entirely," I said. "But I will be. That's not the same thing, but it's enough for right now." I believed that when I said it. The offer came on a Friday, delivered not through Margaret, but directly to my personal email, which meant they had made a deliberate choice to bypass formal channels, to make it feel less like a legal document and more like a conversation between people. Daniel's attorneys were smart. I had to acknowledge that. The email was written in the careful, reasonable language of people who believe that reasonableness is itself a form of pressure. It acknowledged, in vague terms, that there had been financial arrangements during the marriage that were not fully transparent. It offered a settlement, a lump sum of $400,000, the Honda replaced with a new vehicle, and 2 years of spousal support at $3,000 per month. In exchange, I would sign a comprehensive release waiving any further claims against Daniel, Mercer Advisory Group, or any related entities. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Margaret with a single line. "See attached." "My answer is no." She called within the hour. "Good," she said, and I could hear something satisfied in her voice. They wouldn't offer $400,000 if the real number wasn't significantly larger. "I know," I said. "That's what the offer told me." What the offer had told me, specifically, was this. The $3 million balance on the Crestline card was likely not the ceiling. It was probably not even close to the ceiling. David Park had been digging for 3 weeks and had found 1 LLC, 1 condo, 1 personal account. Daniel had 15 years of financial architecture to work with. The offer was designed to make me stop before David found the rest of it. I was not going to stop. But there was something else the offer did. Something its authors probably hadn't intended. It clarified for me, with crystalline precision, exactly who I was dealing with. Not a man who felt guilt, who wanted to make something right. A man who had done the calculation and decided I was worth, at most, $400,000 plus a car. After 15 years. After everything. I sat with that for a day. Then I set it aside. Anger was fuel, but only if it was controlled. Sasha was watching. I sensed it without being able to prove it. Cars I didn't recognize parked on our street longer than they should have been, a social media account that had followed several of my public professional profiles. Margaret warned me to assume I was being observed and to conduct myself accordingly. I did, but the watching told me something too. They were unsure. People watch when they're trying to read a situation they can't control. I was behaving in ways they couldn't predict, and that uncertainty was, however modestly, mine. The social support came from an unexpected direction. I had attended a continuing education seminar for financial professionals in late November, about 6 weeks into the legal process. I almost didn't go. I was exhausted, and the drive to Cleveland felt unnecessary. But Margaret had told me firmly that I needed to maintain the appearance of a functioning professional life, and she was right. I sat next to a woman named Patricia Cole at the morning session. She was in her late 50s, a CPA with her own firm in Akron. We talked during the coffee break about nothing consequential: audit changes, software updates, the usual professional small talk. Then, for reasons I still can't entirely explain, I told her a truncated version of what was happening. Not everything, but enough. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "My first husband hid money too. Different era, different methods, same impulse, keeping you small so he could stay large." I didn't know what to say. "What helped me," she said, "wasn't the money I got back in the end, although that helped too. It was having one person who wasn't involved and wasn't panicking, who could just tell me I wasn't crazy." She handed me her card. Over the following weeks, Patricia became something I hadn't known I was missing: a stable, external point of reference. She wasn't tangled in it. She wasn't Lily, who was too close and too young. She wasn't Renata, who meant well but amplified anxiety. She was someone who had been through a version of it, who had come out functional and self-possessed, who could look at what I was doing and say, "Yes, you're doing this right." We had coffee twice in December. Once I drove to Akron, once she came to Columbus. Biscuit was ecstatic about the second visit, which I took as a good sign. "How do you feel?" she asked me during that second meeting. I thought about it honestly. "Calm," I said, which still surprises me. "It shouldn't," she said. "You finally know the truth. The truth, even when it's terrible, is less exhausting than the suspicion." She was right. That was exactly it. The 15 years of not quite knowing, of smoothing over the small inconsistencies, of performing trust I no longer fully felt. That had been the real weight. What I was carrying now was heavy, but it was real. And real things can be moved. I drove back to Claremont Hills that evening and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. The oak tree was bare, winter-stripped, every branch visible against the pale sky. I remembered planting it with Daniel, the two of us digging in the November cold, arguing companionably about how deep the roots needed to go. The tree had outlasted everything I'd believed about that day. I went inside, fed the dog, looked over David Park's latest report, which had turned up a second LLC, Cornerstone Asset Management, also Nevada, also Daniel. The number was growing. I was not afraid. They came on a Sunday, which told me it was calculated. Sunday has a quality to it. Slower, softer, more domestic, that people exploit when they want to lower your guard. They came together, which was its own statement. Sasha and Daniel, standing side by side on my front porch at 2 p.m, as though the 12 years of difference in their ages and the 3 years of deception behind them had been resolved into something presentable. I had known they might do something like this. Margaret had actually warned me that a direct approach was a common tactic late in a negotiation. They'll try to make it personal because the legal ground is weakening. I'd filed the warning away. Now I watched them through the side window for a moment before I opened the door. Daniel was wearing the gray coat I'd bought him for his 43rd birthday. I noticed that, with a kind of distant clarity that had become familiar to me. I opened the door. "We'd like to talk," Daniel said. His voice was calm. The same controlled calm he'd had the night he was served, rehearsed. "Just talk, Claire, as people, not through attorneys." "Your attorney is aware you're here?" I asked. A pause. "This isn't about the case." "Everything is about the case," I said. "But come in." I let them into the living room because the alternative was conducting this on the porch, which would have been a performance for the neighborhood. I sat in the armchair. They sat together on the couch, which also told me something. They had choreographed this. Sasha spoke first, which surprised me. She said she wanted to apologize. The apology was precisely articulated. It acknowledged what had happened without naming it specifically, expressed regret for pain caused, and ended with a sentence that had clearly been workshopped. "We both want what's best for Lily and for your future." My daughter's name in her mouth. I kept my expression neutral. Daniel picked up from there. He talked about what I'd lose if this went to full litigation. The time, the exposure, the cost. He talked about Lily being caught in the middle. He talked, in a tone of practiced gentleness, about the years we'd built together and what it would mean to tear that down in a courtroom. He said, "There's still a version of this that doesn't have to be a war." I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Daniel, the version that wasn't a war was the version where you told me the truth 15 years ago, or 10, or 5, or last year. Any of those versions would have been less than this. You chose not to take any of them. Claire, Household Operations LLC, was opened 9 years ago," I said. "David Park found the date in the Nevada filings. Lily was 10 years old when you opened that account. She was 10. Don't put her name in this room." Sasha's composure cracked. It was a small crack, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in her jaw. But I had been watching people's faces for 15 years, and I saw it. "You're being vindictive," she said. Her voice had lost the workshopped quality. "You're doing this to punish him." "I'm doing this," I said, "because half of everything he has is legally mine. That isn't vindictiveness, that's property law." Daniel leaned forward. "And this is the moment I want to be precise about, because it was the moment when the performance ended and I saw clearly who he was." His voice dropped. He said, "You should think carefully about what you're starting. I have resources you don't. I have relationships in this city that you don't. I can make this process very long and very expensive and very public for you in ways you haven't considered." It was a threat, dressed as pragmatism, but a threat. "Are you threatening me?" I asked very clearly, so that if anyone ever asked me, I would be able to say, I asked directly. "I'm being realistic," he said. "I'll tell Margaret you stopped by," I said. "Please don't come to the house again without going through our attorneys." I stood up. I walked to the door. After a moment, they both rose. Sasha looked at me once more. I couldn't read the look. Something between anger and something I might have called, in another context, recognition. Then they left. I stood at the door until their car reached the end of Birchwood Lane. Then I went to the kitchen, sat down, and felt, for the first time in weeks, a thread of genuine fear move through me. Not panic, fear. The specific fear of someone who has been told, not implicitly but plainly, that the other side has power and intends to use it. But here is what I noticed about that fear. It didn't make me want to stop. If anything, it had the opposite effect. His willingness to threaten me in my own living room, with her sitting next to him, it told me exactly how much he had to lose. People with nothing to hide don't threaten. People who are confident in their legal position don't come to your house on a Sunday. I called Patricia that evening and told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. "Good," she said when I finished. "Let them be afraid. Afraid people make mistakes." I wrote down what Daniel had said, as close to verbatim as I could reconstruct, and emailed it to Margaret at 7 o'clock Sunday evening. She replied within the hour, "This is useful. Get some sleep." I did, almost. The deposition was held on a Tuesday in February, in a conference room on the 3rd floor of a downtown building, where the heat worked too well and the fluorescent lights had a faint, institutional hum. There were 6 of us in the room. Margaret and me on one side of the table, Daniel and his Mitchell and Greer attorney, a man named Reyes, silver-haired, precise, on the other, plus a court reporter in the corner, and David Park, who sat against the wall with 2 accordion folders and a laptop. Daniel had dressed carefully. Navy suit, the good one. Controlled expression, the practiced kind. He nodded at me when he came in. A single businesslike nod, as though we were acquaintances at a professional event, as though the Sunday visit had been administrative. I nodded back and looked at my notes. Margaret opened by walking Daniel through the basics. When had Household Operations LLC been formed? Who were the registered agents? What was the purpose of the entity? Reyes objected to several phrasings. Daniel answered in the careful, constructed language of someone who has rehearsed with lawyers for weeks. To his knowledge, the LLC was established for legitimate investment purposes. The transfers from the joint account were related to shared business expenses. He would need to review records to confirm specific dates. He was composed. I gave him that. Then Margaret turned to David Park's report. She began with the money. The documented total of funds traced from our joint marital accounts into Household Operations LLC over 9 years. The number, now finalized after 3 months of forensic accounting, was $387,000. Not a rounding error, not shared business expenses. Nearly $400,000. Daniel's jaw moved. He looked at Reyes. Reyes said, "Counsel, I'd note for the record that the forensic methodology used to arrive at this figure has not been stipulated to by our client. The methodology is documented in 47 pages of supporting analysis," Margaret said pleasantly, "which your office received in full on February 3rd. She moved to the condo, the $410,000 Short North property. Daniel had, in his preparation, constructed an explanation for this. The property was a legitimate investment asset held by the LLC, entirely separate from marital finances, purchased with funds from Mercer Advisory Group, not the joint account. Then Margaret produced a document I hadn't seen before. David Park had found it in the 4th week of his investigation, a wire transfer receipt, dated 3 years ago, originating from an account in Daniel's personal name, not the business, not the LLC, transferring $147,000 directly toward the condo's purchase price. Daniel stared at the document. "Can you explain the source of these personal funds?" Margaret asked. A pause. Reyes leaned in, murmured something. Daniel said, "I would need to review my personal records to speak to the specific source of that transfer." "Of course," Margaret said. "Let's move to the Crestline account." This was the part I had been waiting for. Over 4 months, David Park had reverse-engineered the Crestline account's contribution history. The $3 million balance was not simply savings. It was layered, business revenue that had been deliberately routed away from Mercer Advisory's declared earnings before they could be assessed as marital income. redirected through a series of transactions that David described in his report as a structured pattern of income diversion consistent with deliberate asset concealment. When Margaret read that phrase aloud in the conference room, something happened to Daniel's face, not guilt. I want to be clear even now that I never saw guilt from him, not once in that room. What I saw was the expression of a man who has built an elaborate structure and is watching in real time as someone accurately describes every beam and joint of it. It wasn't shame. It was the specific, terrible exposure of being precisely understood. Mr. Mercer, Margaret said, over the 15-year period of your marriage to Claire, can you explain why the declared income reported on your joint tax returns was consistently lower, in some years by as much as 40%, than the actual revenue generated by Mercer Advisory Group? Reyes objected. Daniel began an answer that involved the phrase, business reinvestment. Margaret produced 3 more documents. Daniel's answer changed slightly. Margaret produced a 4th document. The answer changed again. He contradicted himself 3 times in the space of 9 minutes. I wrote down the page numbers in my notes. The court reporter's fingers moved without pause. Then Margaret asked about Sasha Brennan, her role at Mercer Advisory, her co-registration on the Household Operations LLC, the joint personal account. Daniel said she was an employee. Margaret produced the LLC co-registration documents. Daniel said the LLC arrangement had been a business decision. Margaret produced emails, obtained through formal discovery, in which Daniel referred to Sasha in writing as the other half of everything I've built. He went still. Mr. Mercer, Margaret said, is Sasha Brennan your romantic partner? A very long pause. That's not relevant to... It's directly relevant to the question of whether assets concealed from your spouse were transferred to or used for the benefit of a third party during the marriage. Under Ohio law, that distinction affects. Yes, he said. The words sat in the room. I looked at him then. Not with anger. I was past anger by that point. I looked at him the way you look at the answer to an equation you've been working for a long time, with a kind of exhausted recognition. After the deposition in the elevator down, Margaret stood beside me and said nothing until the doors opened. He'll want to settle now, she said, by the end of the week. What do we ask for? I said. She told me. I said, yes. Reyes called Margaret on Thursday. She had predicted the end of the week. She was 2 days early. The opening offer from Mitchell and Greer was still, if I'm honest, insulting. A reflection less of what was realistic and more of what their client had asked them to try. It acknowledged some financial irregularity and offered a revised settlement of $700,000 plus the Honda replacement, framed as a generous departure from their original position. Margaret responded the same afternoon with a counter that was not a negotiation opener. It was a statement of what the law entitled me to, backed by 47 pages of forensic documentation and a deposition transcript in which Daniel had contradicted himself on the record 3 times. She told Reyes, professionally, that we were prepared to proceed to trial. They called back on Friday morning. The negotiation lasted 11 days. I was not in the room for most of it. That was deliberate, Margaret's strategy, because my presence was most useful as a fact in the background rather than a person across the table. David Park was there for the financial sessions. I was at home, doing bookkeeping, walking Biscuit, calling Lily, living the ordinary mechanics of my life with more intention than I had in years. On the 11th day, Margaret called me at 9 in the morning. They've accepted, she said. I sat down at the kitchen table with my coffee. The settlement was as follows. I received 50% of all documented marital assets, including the Crestline account, which by final reckoning held $3.2 million. resulting in my share of $1.6 million. I received the Short North condo, which we would sell, with proceeds split in proportion, adjusted to account for the $147,000 in personal funds Daniel had used for its purchase. I received restitution for the $387,000 transferred from our joint account to Household Operations LLC over 9 years, plus interest calculated from the date of each transfer. I received the Birchwood Lane house outright. Daniel signed over his interest as part of the broader asset resolution. I received spousal support for 7 years at a level that reflected the actual standard of living concealed from me, not the manufactured scarcity I'd been given instead. I also received biscuit, which I had not thought to include in the demands, and which Margaret had added herself. Small victories matter, she told me afterward. Daniel retained his business. Mercer Advisory Group remained his, but under a structured disclosure agreement and with a forensic monitor appointed for 2 years to ensure tax compliance. His name appeared in the Columbus Business Journal, briefly, in a story about the case that named no individuals but described its outlines with enough specificity that people who knew him would know. Reyes had tried hard to prevent that. He didn't succeed. Sasha Brennan was not a party to the divorce settlement, but she had co-signed the LLC documents, and the Ohio Attorney General's office, which Margaret had quietly notified 3 months earlier, had opened a separate inquiry into the LLC's financial activities and their tax implications. That process would take time. It was not my legal fight to manage. But it existed. The signing happened in Margaret's conference room on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel was there, and Reyes. I was there, and Margaret. Daniel and I sat at opposite ends of the table, which was appropriate. He looked at me once, before we began. I don't know what he was looking for. I kept my expression neutral and professional because that is who I was in that room. Not his wife, not his victim, but a party to a legal resolution. When everything was signed, I gathered my documents, shook Margaret's hand, and walked to the elevator. Reyes held the elevator door for me. A small, automatic politeness. "Thank you," I said, and meant it for no one in particular. I drove the Honda home. It still had the check engine light. I realized, going to miss that car a little. I'd driven a lot of hard miles in it, but I could afford something different now. I sat in the driveway on Birchwood Lane, looking at the house that was entirely mine and the bare oak tree in the front yard, and I thought, this is what it feels like when a long, heavy thing is over. Not triumphant, exactly. Not the movie version of a victory, where the music swells and everything feels clean. More like the feeling of setting down something you've carried so long you'd forgotten how heavy it was. And then feeling, in the absence of the weight, the strange new lightness of your own hands. I went inside, fed the dog, made coffee, called Lily. "Mom," she said, when I told her it was done. "Are you okay? For real?" "Yes," I said, "for real." And this time, I didn't add any qualifications. A year and a half after the signing, I was standing in the kitchen of a different house. Not Birchwood Lane. I'd sold it 8 months after the divorce was finalized, because living in a house built on 15 years of carefully maintained illusion had a particular quality I didn't want to renovate around. The new house was smaller, closer to downtown Columbus, with a garden the previous owner had maintained with more enthusiasm than expertise, which meant I got to rebuild it from scratch. I liked that. I was making coffee on a Saturday morning, watching Biscuit claim the sun-warmed back corner of the garden as her permanent headquarters, when my phone buzzed. Patricia texting from Akron. "How's the new kitchen treating you?" I sent back a photo of the coffee and the dog. In the 18 months since the deposition, I had expanded my bookkeeping practice. The clients who'd nearly left during the Mitchell and Greer intimidation campaign had not only stayed but referred others. I'd hired an assistant named Dara, a Columbus State accounting student who was faster than me at the software. I'd taken Lily to the Oregon coast for a week in July. The vacation Daniel had refused years ago with those 4 words. The coast had been everything. I was also taking a woodworking class on Thursday evenings. I was bad at it. I liked being bad at it. The shelf I was building for the garden shed had required 3 attempts and 3 different kinds of wood, and it was the most uncomplicated pleasure I could remember. My credit was in my own name. My accounts were my own. My financial decisions were mine alone to make. That sounds like a simple thing. It is not a simple thing. As for Daniel, the business journal piece had been brief, but Columbus is not a large professional community. Within 6 months, Mercer Advisory had lost 4 of its 7 major clients. He had retained the business, but it was smaller and quieter. The forensic monitor had found 2 additional financial irregularities in the first year, which generated their own consequences. He had moved to an apartment in Dublin. I knew this only because Lily told me. Sasha Brennan. The AG inquiry resolved with a civil settlement and dissolution of the LLC. She had left Mercer Advisory during the legal process. She and Daniel had separated sometime in the spring. That information settled in me without ceremony. What I had noticed, and I want to be precise about this, was that the version of their life that had apparently seemed worth destroying a marriage for had not proven durable once the protection of secrecy was gone. They had existed in the space his lies maintained. Without the lies, the space closed. On the Sunday before Thanksgiving, Lily drove up and we cooked together in the new kitchen. We ate at a table I'd picked out myself, in a house that was entirely mine. Biscuit stole a piece of turkey and was absolutely unrepentant. "Mom," Lily said, watching me, "you look different, less careful." Less careful. 15 years of careful. Every word measured. Every financial decision filtered through a man who had been lying for all of it. The careful had felt like protection. What it had actually been was a cage I'd helped maintain. "Yeah," I said, "that sounds right." Outside, the November light was flat and clear. I was 42 years old, and I was, without qualification, all right. Looking back now, the card in the blazer pocket was never the real discovery. The real discovery was what I found in myself when I stopped smoothing things over and started paying attention. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Trust your own arithmetic. When something doesn't add up and someone keeps telling you the numbers are fine, believe your ledger. You are entitled to the truth about your own life. What would you have done? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more. Thank you for listening.